All right, everyone, welcome back to the Kyle Anslone Show. And I'm very excited today because for the first time, I have a guest joining me on today's program. And there's really nobody better for me to have on as the first guest of the Kyle Anslone Show than my colleague from antiwar.com, our news editor, Dave DeCamp. Dave, welcome to the program. How you doing today?
Good, Kyle. Very happy to be on. Honored to be the first interview for the Kyle Anslone Show.
All right. Well, first of all, Dave, thank you for being here. For people who don't know Dave, when you go to antiwar.com in the morning, the first, third or half of a page that loads when it comes up is the news section. And I would say 6, 8, sometimes even 10 articles there are write-ups from Dave on all the important things going on in the world. He strips out all the mainstream bias. When you go to Reuters and the AP, you have to hear how the war in the genocide in Gaza is because of October 7th and the war in Ukraine is unprovoked. There's none of that garbage at antiwar.com. And usually, if I'm lucky, I contribute with a story of my to our own every day there. So, Dave, we got a lot to talk about on today's show. Of course, we are headed back to the Trump era, and that means these long press conferences that at times are really absolutely wild and at least far more entertaining than even who knows what dementia Biden is going to say. He may, ramble or mumble something off and they, yank him off the stage. This is no longer these like highly choreographed and scripted environments. And we hear a lot of surprising things like maybe the U.S. is going to invade Greenland or Panama, or we're going to use economic coercion to take over Canada. So there's certainly a lot of ground to cover on today's show. I really want to start off with the most practical things and the most concerning things that the president said. So let's go ahead and play clip number 1, Trump talking about Gaza.
Do you think they're waiting for President Trump to take office?
No, I think they heard him loud and clear. Better get done by the inaugural.
But when you say all hell will
Before
be
I
paid,
take office.
that all hell must be paid if they don't release the hostages.
Well, do I have to define it for you? Look, all
No, I know
hell
you're not
will
gonna
break out.
telegraph
If
what-
those hostages aren't back, I don't want to hurt your negotiation. If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East.
Can you elaborate?
And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out. I don't have to say anymore, but that's what it is. And they should have given them back a long time. They should have never taken them. If the deal isn't done before I take office, which is now going to be 2 weeks, all hell will break out in the Middle East. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. President.
You've done a great job.
Thank you.
So, Dave, I mean, you have seen the images and covered day in and day out the death and destruction in Gaza. It's hell on earth already. So, what is Trump talking about when he said all hell is going to break out after he takes office?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Anybody who's been following this knows that Gaza is already hell, and it has been hell for a long time. So that is the question. What does he mean here? And in his original post, the first time he made this threat, which was in early December on his Truth Social account, he hinted that he might be threatening U.S. military action here. He said it would be something like the biggest, the greatest, the worst. I forget exactly how he worded it, but one of the worst things in the attacks in the history of the United States or something. So basically hinting that he might be threatening that the U.S. could actually bomb Gaza, which, I mean, if you look at Gaza, it's not like nobody's ever thought of bombing it. He acts like things could really get worse for the Palestinians, which at this point, it can't get much worse. And this also, makes you think back to 2017 and the early days of his first administration when he was threatening North Korea, talking about fire and fury. And that was, essentially turned out to be part of a negotiating tactic. So hopefully that's all this is here, and that he's not really threatening to escalate things anymore in Gaza, because again, it's hard to imagine things getting any worse.
Well, you know, what could he really be talking about here? Do you think that Israel would even allow or welcome U.S. troops to help carry out raids or ground operations in Gaza? Do you think Trump would go that route? And then as far as bombing goes, I mean, you know, you've seen the same images that I have. Israel's issue is not that maybe they want more bombs from the U.S., but they're more than willing to hit any target. And so it's not exactly like they need U.S. planes to help them drop bombs. So what exactly could the U.S. even do here, David? Is there anything? I mean, just I'm wondering if you could think of anything that he would be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine any scenario where they're going to send U.S. troops in. I mean, that would just be, you know, there has been all these reports of this talk or the U.S. getting special forces prepared for the idea, but that's just something I can't really imagine. But again, besides that, I mean, what else could they do if they just bomb Gaza more? I mean, that's not going to solve anything. So it is tough to really know what he means here. And it's not a good sign. I mean, it goes to show that he just doesn't really have a grip on what's actually happening in Gaza and what the actual impediment to a hostage deal has been, which has been Netanyahu. And that's something, you know, if you read Israeli media, if you hear what Israeli officials have to say, you know, that's the consensus, is that Netanyahu and the members of his coalition government that don't want a deal are the reason why there's been no hostage deal. I mean, that's crystal clear. And that was Hamas's response to the initial threat was, well, your threat should be aimed at, you know, someone else. And now I just don't see, you know, you have that guy Steve Witkoff, who's been named as Trump's envoy to the Middle East. He's involved in the negotiations. He's saying he thinks there could be a deal by the inauguration. I'm very skeptical of that. But at least when you hear him talk, Witkoff talk, he sounded pretty diplomatic in that press conference, because they were asking him, you know, what is impeding the deal? Why hasn't there been a deal yet? And he said he didn't want to say. He said he didn't want to be negative. And compared to what the Biden administration has been saying, you know, all they do is just blame Hamas. It is kind of a different approach that he seems to be taking. But again, I'm just doubtful that something's going to happen by January 20th.
Yeah, you know, that is less than a week away, Dave, and we have seen people within the Israeli government, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, sabotage the talks, and so you would certainly think he could delay it at least through the inauguration, and who knows how quickly Trump would try to add to back up that threat. And I do kind of wonder if maybe that threat is really directed in some respects at Iran or something like that. But Trump went on in that press conference, Dave. It wasn't just talking about Gaza. He also talked about the war and the conflict in Syria. And of course, you know, again, Trump is just interesting because you get a little bit more bluntness and a little bit more missions than you expect from a U.S. president. So let's play this next clip.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. It's good to see you again. Two questions about Syria and the ongoing war in Gaza. About Syria, the Pentagon disclosed last month the U.S. has some 2,000 troops in Syria. That's almost double the number initially we were told of 900. Will you keep that troop capacity the same upon taking over?
Well, I won't tell you that because that's part of a military strategy, but I will say it was Turkey. Turkey's been after that country in different names and different forms and shapes for 2,000 years. Those people that went in are from Turkey. And President Erdogan is a friend of mine. He's a guy I like, respect. I think he respects me also. He's the one that didn't go after certain people after I requested that he not. You know who I'm talking about, the Kurds. I don't know how long that's going to, because they're natural enemies. They hate each other. But he didn't do that yet. And he didn't do it in the past also. He started, and I said, please don't do that, and he didn't do it. So, but if you look at what happened with Syria, Russia was weakened, Iran was weakened, and he's a very smart guy. And he sent his people in there through different forms and different names, and they went in and they took over, and that's the way it is.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Do you have concerns about HTS taking control of Syria?
By the way, I have the envoy here. Is that in the back? It is. Standing with my son, Eric, is Steve Witkoff, who's just got back from the Middle East, and he's done a fantastic job. He's a great deal maker. I said, what we need there is a deal maker, because nobody makes a deal. We have people that understand where the rivers are and where the meets and bounds are, but they can't talk. They can't make deals. Steve's done a great job. I just want to thank you, Steve. You've been working endlessly for months, and he's working specifically on the hostages, trying to get them back.
So, Dave, Trump, has said this before. He really likes to blame Turkey for, or give Turkey credit for what's happened in Syria, depending on how you want to look at that. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on Trump pinning the blame here on Turkey. How accurate is that? And is he leaving out any other major players?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely other players when we're talking about Syria. There's all sorts of players, but he is right that this was very largely driven by Turkey. There were reports in Western media that said Turkish intelligence gave HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this al-Qaeda group that launched the offensive, that Turkey gave them the green light. It's been an open secret for years that they were backing HTS in Idlib, keeping that territory out of the hands of Assad and Russia. And also, besides HTS, you have this group that calls themselves the Syrian National Army, the SNA. They're fighting the Kurds in the north, and they were involved in the offensive against Assad. Of course, you have the other players. Israel was bombing Syria, really ramped up the strikes in the weeks leading up to this offensive. And the U.S. got one of their proxy groups prepared to take part in this HTS offensive. So there are a lot of players, but Turkey is a very big one here. I mean, Syria is right on their border. And they've been in conflict with the Kurds for a long time. And Erdogan's always kind of had his eye on this sort of expansionism in northern Syria. So, yeah, I think he's right. And again, that's not something you're going to hear from most presidents. They act like it's an organic revolution, not driven by foreign jihadists or anything. But, yeah, the big question is, how is he going to handle this? It's a really strange situation that he's inheriting when it comes to Syria.
Right. There's this, the U.S. has basically 4 allies now in Syria, all with competing interests. The Israelis, who have taken a large, swath of territory. Turkey, who's taken another chunk of territory in the north. Our Kurdish allies, and then HTS, the Syrian Sunni groups that we've backed over the past few years. And so, Dave, I'm wondering if you have any forecasting on how the U.S. might try to resolve these disputes, as Israel seems like they're going to have some issues with Jolani's government in Damascus. The Turks certainly have issues with the Kurds, and there's reporting every day at antiwar.com now hundreds of deaths in the fighting between those two forces in the north. Any idea how Trump's going to handle or manage all of this?
Yeah, that's something that seems to really be going under the radar, is that there has been this very heavy fighting in northern Syria between the U.S.-backed Kurds, the SDF, and this Turkish-backed SNA. And that's something Jason Ditz has been covering for us, and he just wrote up a story. The Kurds are suggesting that U.S. troops could be deployed in northern Syria. The U.S. and French troops could be deployed in northern Syria. It's part of like a buffer zone to separate the Kurdish forces from Turkey and the Turkish-backed groups. So that's an idea that they just floated. And we did learn recently that the Pentagon has been lying to us about the number of U.S. troops in Syria. They've said 900 for years, but the real number is 2,000. And, that's a pretty substantial force there. So that's something it's really hard to predict. I'm at a loss to try to predict how he's going to handle each specific situation here in the Middle East. I would be surprised if he would go for an idea like that, putting U.S. troops right in the middle. He might just let Turkey go in and maybe pull back from the north. Is there a chance that he just pulls out of Syria? I guess that's possible. It's something he, tried to do a few times before. But at the same time, he's saying he's the best friend Israel ever had, and Israel's not going to want the U.S. to leave Syria. So, yeah, a lot of questions about how he's going to handle this. Yeah. I think if the Biden administration, if the Kamala or Harris administration was coming in, I think they would probably go for something like the Kurds are suggesting, like deploying U.S. troops there. But I don't know if the Trump administration is going to go for that.
Yeah, and I haven't seen any reporting on this, Dave, so you may not know, but any idea on how Trump is going to react to the new government in Damascus? It would seem like there's maybe at least some members of his administration that would be able to identify a terrorist, but at the same time, the consensus in Washington seems to be an embrace of HTS. And I believe you covered just this week that the U.S. government has lifted some sanctions on the group.
Yeah, they issued like a license to waive sanctions. They haven't actually lifted sanctions on Syria, but they issued this 6-month license to allow certain transactions with this HTS-led government. And Jelani, their leader, again, these are Al-Qaeda guys. I mean, there was just this video that came out of Syria's new justice minister, of him overseeing executions in Idlib in northwest Syria in 2015. The execution of women, 2 women, for charges of adultery and prostitution. And he read out their death sentences, and then they got shot in the head. I mean, these are the people who took power, who the U.S. and Israel helped take power. So, I think Trump does understand some of that. And some of the people that he's put in, especially Tulsi Gabbard, she's going to be the director of national intelligence. She understands who these people are. So I think, we might see kind of an internal fight within the Biden administration among these people. Marco Rubio, I'm sure, would be happy to give recognition to HTS and lift the terror designation. But then you'll have Tulsi, I would imagine, would be opposed to that. So I think there might be some real kind of debate within the administration about what to do.
Yeah, and so Dave, I think there's situations where Trump is going to have an awkward game to play as he tries to manage the interests of U.S. allies. And then there's going to be other situations in the Middle East where I think Trump is going to see things very black and white and very clearly. And this is going to be issues of the Israelis versus the Palestinians, the Israelis versus the Iranians. And with Trump coming into office, it seems that there are really some in the government in Tel Aviv who are looking to exploit this. The CNN reported this past week that they're going to try to allow less aid into Gaza after Trump takes office. And then we also had this tweet from Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. And if we could put this up on screen, he writes in this tweet, the terrorism in Judea and Samaria, and that's what the Israelis call the West Bank and what they'll name it after they take it from the Palestinians. And he continues, and the terrorism from Gaza and Iran is the same terrorism, and it must be defeated. Those who trust the Palestinian Authority to maintain the security of Israeli citizens wake up to a morning when terrorists are again slaughtering Jewish residents. Jenin needs to look like Jabalia so that Kar Saba does not become a Gaza village, God forbid. I demand from Prime Minister an urgent cabinet meeting today to discuss change in perception and the true eradication of terrorism from Judea and Samaria. And of course, Dave, as you have been covering day in and day out at antiwar.com, the Jabalia, formerly this massive refugee camp home to hundreds of thousands of people, is now a smoldering pile of rubble. And so is he really just calling openly now for genocide in the West Bank? Is that what we're seeing here?
Yeah, and this isn't anything new for Smotrich. This is, he's for a long time been on record that he wants, to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank and take it over. And he's very happy about all this destruction and death in the Gaza Strip and certainly wants to replicate it in the West Bank. And there are some bad signs that the incoming Trump administration might support some really ramped up operations in the West Bank. The fact that they appointed Mike Huckabee as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. I mean, it's essentially appointing an ambassador. He's going to act more like an Israeli ambassador to the U.S. with his track record of how much he supports Israeli expansion in the West Bank. He's on record saying there's no such thing as a settlement. There's no such thing as the West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. He's even said there's no such thing as a Palestinian, and that all the other Arab states must absorb these Arabs that live in this land that was historically called Palestine. This is who Trump named to be the ambassador. And he had a similar ambassador the last time he was in power, David Friedman, who, again, these guys essentially act on behalf of Israel to lobby the U.S. government to do things. Friedman was the one who convinced Trump to recognize the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. And so we're going to see Huckabee be pushing for this stuff. And again, it's just a bad sign that he's been put in that position.
Yeah. So, Dave, about once a week, I read one of your articles at antiwar.com, and I see the headline, and I think I really hope that Dave must have gotten something wrong here. And always, unfortunately, the truth is just as horrific as you write it. But this article here, report military action against Iran will be a real possibility under Trump. And you write, military action against Iran's nuclear facilities will be a real possibility under the incoming Trump administration, Axios reported on Monday. So, Dave, say it ain't so. Say it isn't this bad that Trump is really possibly going to go through with this.
Well, this is based, this is from Axios. These are reports that we're getting here. But the reason why I think this is a bad sign is because, and I've seen this from a few places, is that report said Ron Dermer, who's a Israeli minister for strategic affairs, basically, which makes him a close advisor to Netanyahu. He said that he left a meeting with Trump in Mar-a-Lago recently, believing that Trump would either support Israeli attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities or order a direct U.S. strike on those nuclear facilities. And we also saw Trump a few months ago, this was before the election, he criticized Biden for saying that Israel shouldn't bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. And Trump's history when it comes to the nuke, the Iran's nuclear program, is that he listens to the Israelis. It was a big part of his campaign in 2016 to trash the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And then he came in and Netanyahu gave this whole presentation about how they were violating the deal, and Trump pulled out. And the fact is there was no real evidence that they were violating this deal. And now, since Trump left it, they've increased this uranium enrichment. Still no sign that they're going to make a bomb. They're not at the 90% level, of uranium enrichment needed to make the bomb. Now, there has been talk within Iran from Iranian parliament questioning if they should rethink their policy, their prohibition on the development of nuclear weapons. But there's no sign that the Ayatollah has considered lifting that edict, that fatwa, as they call it. But, if you see the media coverage of it, there's all this talk about, Iran's a nuclear threshold state because of the 60%. And they really hype it up. And I could see Trump is just going to believe that. Nobody's going to be telling him kind of the reality of the situation. So I could see him, I think it's more likely that he would give Israel the green light to go ahead and strike the nuclear facilities. I think that's probably the more likely possibility than the U.S. actually doing it. But that implies, all these Israeli attacks on Iran recently, the 2 rounds of Israeli airstrikes on Iran. As far as we know, the U.S. didn't directly support them, but the U.S. gave Israel the promise that, basically any backlash, any consequences, we're going to defend you from. So, like, if this thing turns into a full-blown war, we're going to be involved. That's the threat from the U.S. here.
Yeah, I think you lay out the whole case very well there, Dave. Now, I want to take our attention to Ukraine before we wrap up the show here today. There was an interesting statement by Zelensky in his recent interview with Lex Freeman about U.S. weapon shipments to Ukraine. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on this before we wrap up. Let's play this last clip.
We received weapons from the United States of America, from Europe. If we take, for example, money from the United States of America, during all this time of the war, around 177 billion have been voted for or decided upon. 177 billion. Let's be honest. We have not received half of this money.
So, Dave, if we're being honest here, does it sound right to you that Ukraine hasn't received half of that money? And also, to the best of your ability, try to break down the numbers a little bit, because I think Zelensky may be conflating the numbers of financial aid versus military aid.
Yeah, so he said 177 billion there, and that would be the combined, I just wrote something up. Lloyd Austin, he did his last little meeting of what they call the Ukraine Defense Contact Group that he's been overseeing since this war started. And he said, together we've promised 125 billion for Ukraine. and that's the U.S. and the NATO countries combined military aid, and that's just military equipment they're talking about. So that's a more realistic number. And then, I'm not sure about how the other countries do it, but when it comes to the U.S., there's basically two main types of military aid that they provided Ukraine. And one of them is what they call this Presidential Drawdown Authority, which they ship weapons straight to Ukraine from U.S. stockpiles so they could just send them right away. And then there's also this Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, under which the U.S. purchases weapons for Ukraine. And, a lot of the aid has been in that form. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but that takes a while. You got to enter the contract. They got to, in a lot of cases, they have to produce the weapons. That can take years and years. You see some weapons contracts aren't fulfilled for like 5 to 10 years. So that's a possibility that, that could explain a lot of this, what he's complaining about. And, just really is something after all these years, almost 3 years now, of the West completely funding his war effort, allowing him to stay in power, that he, complains like that in this interview with Lex Friedman.
Yeah, well, in a way, it's not surprising, Dave, because that seems to kind of be the Zelensky playbook, right? He's grateful after he gets the aid, and then about a month later, he's begging for more and saying that they haven't gotten enough, and they haven't gotten enough when they needed it. And maybe in some respects it's true, but overall, they've gotten plenty from the United States. But Dave DeCamp, thank you so much for joining me and being my first guest here on the Kyle Anslone Show. We'll be out with another episode soon. Thank you all for tuning in.